So wall jumping was the one thing that was actually a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. I assumed that you could just launch them away from specific objects, but I didn't really know how to set that up properly. The other solution was potentially like trying to get the player's rotation and trying to find out which side of the wall that they're on and then launching them away from that wall. But I eventually found a much easier solution, and that's very similar to how I set up the walls to begin with. I gave each wall another tag, and I basically labeled them north, south, east, and west. Because if I couldn't get where the player was, I could probably figure out which wall they were on. And if I could figure out which wall they were on, then I can just launch them away from that specific wall. So again, I used the tags north, east, south, and west. And that did work, but the logic would get very confused and get very broken. So I asked one of my programmer friends for help, and he was able to help me out in figuring out a much smarter way of doing it. So instead of trying to give each of them another tag to try and think about and get confused, we instead made a new wall blueprint, and this wall blueprint had an integer called which wall. And similar to north, east, south, and west, I was able to label them 1, 2, 3, and 4. And with this custom event here, I was able to set up this sequence that asks the question, which wall are we on? 1, 2, 3, and 4. And depending on which wall we're on, I can then figure out which way I need to send them. This is a much more effective way of doing it. There are probably like 1,000 different other ways of doing it, but this is the one that worked for me in this project. The other mechanic that was a lot harder to implement than I first thought was the dash or blink mechanic. So the way this works is that you press shift and it will initiate a cool spectral dash, much similar to the one that they have in Shinobi. And I thought you could just launch the character forward, but it launches it forward in world space and not in regards to the character. So I had to set up this system that gets the player's forward vector, and doesn't mind which way they're facing. It will just always be the forward vector. And I timed that by 1,000 in order to get the launch velocity to fire them forward. And this worked great in the air, but on ground it would always send them off in weird directions. And I eventually figured out that's due to the collision and the friction that you have on the ground. So in order to bypass that, I broke that vector down and added a little bit to the z-axis, otherwise known as the up axis. So the shift actually launches the player off the ground a little bit and bypasses that friction, which I thought was quite a nice way of doing it, and it gives a really nice effect. As for the other part of the blink animation, the after images that happen, I created my own dynamic material instant, and I attached that to the transformation of the player's mesh. So this effectively gets whatever pose the player character is in, and it creates a copy of it behind with that material attached to it. And this creates a really nice after image effect that I've set up with a timeline to just fade away so it doesn't eat up the frames at spawning loads of these things in. In the next video, I'm going to cover the last remaining bits of code and wrap up my feelings on this project.